Everyone assumed she was just a child, sweet, observant, innocent. But behind palace doors, Princess Charlotte had seen far more than anyone realized. And when she finally spoke the truth about Queen Camilla's private behavior, the entire monarchy trembled. This wasn't just a moment of honesty, it was an emotional reckoning, a whisper that would grow into a storm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. From the moment she could walk down the echoing marble halls, Charlotte was more than a spectator. Born into a legacy she didn't choose, she absorbed everything: the hushed tones of royal staff, the tension that buzzed behind perfectly rehearsed smiles, and the subtle hierarchy even within her own family. While the world viewed her as a symbol of continuity, behind the scenes, Charlotte was quietly learning the game of silent power plays and veiled emotions. Her connection with Catherine became her grounding force. They weren't just mother and daughter, they were allies in an environment where sincerity often came second to protocol. Catherine offered warmth, consistency, and truth, a sharp contrast to the cool distance that radiated from Camilla. The queen consort never raised her voice or acted cruelly outright, but Charlotte noticed the shifts: the way Camilla's smile vanished the moment a camera turned away, the sidelong glances when praise was heaped on the young princess, the fleeting moments of annoyance when Charlotte would cling to her mother in public. Small things, subtle things. But Charlotte was watching. One moment stayed with her, a quiet evening when she was supposed to be in bed. She had slipped out of her room, drawn by voices near the hallway leading to the private study. She paused, barely breathing, and listened. Camilla's voice, low and clipped, was speaking to a senior aide. Charlotte couldn't catch every word, but phrases lingered. "Control the narrative, not her place. Don't let her overshadow me." The words weren't directed at her, but she felt their weight like icy fingertips brushing her spine. She returned to her room that night with a heaviness that no child should carry. It was Catherine who gently encouraged her to express her feelings, not through confrontation, but through reflection. She gifted her daughter a diary, not for royal obligations or polished reflections, but for truth. "Write what you feel, no matter what," Catherine had told her softly. "Even if no one reads it, the truth always finds its time." And so, Charlotte began to write. In small letters with childlike simplicity but startling clarity, she began documenting not just events but how they made her feel. And with every page, something within her grew bolder. Not rebellious, but aware. Aware that behind the polished veneer of crowns and titles, there existed emotional fault lines no one dared to name. She had no plan, no agenda, only a sense that what she saw mattered. That her silence, like the silence of so many before her, would only serve those who feared exposure. But the palace had no idea that a child's quiet truth was about to shatter the illusion it had worked so hard to protect. The queen consort everyone saw was regal, composed, and smiling for the cameras. But in the shadows of the palace, a very different Camilla emerged, one who wielded subtle power and made no space for dissent, even from the youngest royals. Within the palace walls, behind the layers of protocol and press releases, Camilla was known not for warmth but for her sharp presence. Staff who once viewed her with cautious respect began to recognize patterns: short, clipped instructions that left little room for error, an impatience thinly veiled by formal etiquette. Junior royals, especially the younger children, were rarely given more than obligatory glances or forced smiles. To those who paid attention, it was clear Camilla was drawing boundaries, and those who did not serve her narrative were gently, but unmistakably, pushed to the periphery. The contrast between her public grace and private demeanor grew starker as time went on. When the cameras flashed, she played the part flawlessly dutiful, polished, even grandmotherly. But when the world wasn't watching, her tone sharpened. Conversations turned directive, smiles gave way to silence, and there was an unspoken rule: Camilla didn't tolerate deviation, not even from tradition's favored heirs. What irked her most, according to whispers among senior aides, was the glow of admiration surrounding Catherine and Charlotte. The very spotlight Camilla had once fought to enter now threatened to fade beneath the rising radiance of another generation. Jealousy doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smirks, sometimes it rearranges schedules, sometimes it simply ensures that certain names are absent from praise. Charlotte, though young, felt the shift. She wasn't old enough to understand all of it, but her instincts told her something was off. During family gatherings, the air grew heavy whenever Catherine entered the room. Politeness remained, but affection evaporated. The ease with which Catherine carried herself, her bond with Charlotte, and the public's adoration didn't sit well with the woman who had spent decades trying to win the kingdom's approval. And then came the incident that etched itself into Charlotte's mind. It was a fleeting moment, a hallway encounter, when Camilla, unaware of the child's quiet presence, reprimanded a staff member with icy precision. Her words were not cruel, but calculated, designed to belittle while appearing controlled. The staffer apologized profusely, shrinking under the weight of her authority. Charlotte, standing silently behind a doorframe, saw everything. The expression on Camilla's face wasn't one of disappointment, it was satisfaction. That moment shifted something in Charlotte. It wasn't just about how Camilla treated others. It was what that treatment revealed about who she was beneath the crown. Charlotte's growing awareness stirred a quiet fire in her. The more she saw, the more she understood that power could be cloaked in civility, and that kindness, especially from those expected to lead, was not optional, it was essential. Her sense of justice, still raw and forming, began to shape around her mother's example. Catherine was firm but compassionate. Camilla was commanding but distant. And Charlotte, caught between these two models of influence, began to choose who she would mirror, not out of defiance, but out of conviction. It wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. And then came the moment that turned silent observation into action. Charlotte's private truth began its journey toward the public light. Tucked between the pages of a fairy tale book, hidden from every watchful eye, was a diary unlike any other. It didn't belong to a queen or a royal aide, but to Princess Charlotte. And in it, she documented what no one dared say aloud. What began as a suggestion from her mother soon became a sanctuary of ink and honesty. With each quiet night and each unsettling moment, Charlotte picked up her pen not to dramatize, but to preserve. She was young, but not naive. The castle was grand, the crowns were heavy, and the truth was something people only whispered, never spoke. She didn't write for revenge or attention. She wrote because no one else seemed willing to. And slowly, the pages filled with fragments of a childhood shadowed by regal silence and unspoken fears. The ink may have been neat, but the emotions behind it were raw, pulsing with everything she felt but could not voice. There were days when Camilla's gaze made her shrink, moments where she felt her words dissolve in her throat, stifled not by rules but by presence. She wrote of feeling shushed without sound, describing how Camilla's glances could silence a room without ever needing to speak. She noted the way her own laughter faded when Camilla entered, not from discipline, but from discomfort. The diary became a confessional for the things she didn't understand, but instinctively knew weren't right. It wasn't dramatic or exaggerated. It was honest. And in its simplicity, it was devastating. But the entry that changed everything came after a chilling encounter. Charlotte had been playing too loudly in one of the sitting rooms, nothing rebellious, just the energy of a child. Camilla, entering abruptly, told her to know her place. The words were curt, cold, and cutting. At first, Charlotte hadn't grasped the full weight of them. But later, in the quiet of her room, she picked up her diary and wrote it down word for word. She stared at the phrase for a long time before adding a line beneath it. "I thought my place was beside my mum." It was then she realized that some things, even from adults, weren't just unkind, they were unjust. Catherine eventually found the diary, tucked inside a stack of children's books. She read a few entries, then gently placed it back where she found it. She never mentioned it to Charlotte, never demanded an explanation. Perhaps she recognized the necessity of it. Perhaps she understood that her daughter needed to express what the palace would never allow her to say out loud. And perhaps deep down she feared that if Charlotte stopped writing, she might start carrying those truths alone. One entry in particular stood out, a quiet reflection that compared Camilla to a crown without kindness. It wasn't written in anger. It was written in clarity. Charlotte was not attempting to provoke, she was trying to understand. And through her reflections, she began to imagine what might happen if someone else saw what she'd written. There were hints, here and there, that she considered showing it to someone close to her grandfather. A trusted advisor, perhaps, or someone who would listen without judgment. Not to cause scandal, but to find out if what she saw was real, or just the overreactions of a sensitive child. But what began as a private outlet was about to explode into public chaos, all because of one unguarded moment. One misstep, one forgotten journal left on a chair in the drawing room, and suddenly, the palace walls were shaking. A member of staff found it, and within its pages, the words of a princess that no one could ignore. It happened over a quiet family weekend at the estate, an atmosphere that appeared relaxed on the surface, but simmered with tension underneath. Charlotte had been reading alone in one of the sitting rooms, her diary tucked between the folds of a hardcover storybook. Distracted by a sudden call to join the others, she left in haste, never realizing what she had left behind. Hours passed. The room remained untouched, until a senior aide, known for his long-standing loyalty to King Charles, entered to check on preparations and discovered the book. Curiosity overcame protocol. As he flipped through the pages, the fairy tale mask slipped away, revealing something far more consequential, truth written in the quiet voice of a child. His hands trembled as he read. The words weren't filled with hatred or rebellion. They were composed, deeply personal reflections that hinted at a fracture within the royal fabric no one had dared articulate. He knew the weight of what he held. It was more than a child's thoughts, it was evidence. And in that moment, he faced an impossible choice. Protect the child, protect the crown, or risk everything by taking it to the king. Instead, he carried the journal to a private room, locking it away and reaching out to one person he trusted completely, the king's confidential advisor. The news spread fast, but only through tight-lipped whispers behind heavy doors. When word reached Camilla that someone had read Charlotte's private writings, her response was not one of concern, it was fury veiled behind composure. Her voice never rose, her words were never shouted, but those closest to her saw the storm brewing beneath her controlled expression. She demanded to know exactly what had been read, by whom, and what steps had been taken to contain it. Damage control became the silent order of the day, with aides instructed to monitor any trace of the incident leaving the estate. But Catherine was not one to stay silent. The moment she learned of the breach, she sought Camilla directly. It was not a theatrical confrontation, but one laced with emotion and resolve. Catherine defended her daughter with the strength of a mother who had endured too much silence for too long. She didn't accuse, but she didn't excuse. She simply made it clear. What Charlotte wrote was her truth, and no amount of power could silence it. And while the palace scrambled to prevent the fallout, William stood torn between two identities, heir to the throne and father to a young girl whose honesty had exposed more than any political scandal could. The pressure to choose loyalty over love pressed in from all sides. But William wasn't just battling the institution. He was battling his own guilt for not seeing it sooner, for not asking his daughter what she was carrying inside her all this time. But the truth was out, and no royal silence could put it back soon. Charlotte would be asked to speak directly. They called it a family dialogue. But behind the locked doors of Balmoral, it was nothing short of a confrontation. A young girl, a queen consort, and a royal family caught between image and integrity. The air was thick with unspoken rules, generational weight, and the quiet dread of what was about to unfold. King Charles, visibly conflicted, had called the meeting in an attempt to restore order, but what awaited was not resolution, it was reckoning. Charlotte entered the room not with defiance, but with a kind of steady calm that unsettled everyone present. Her diary, now read and dissected behind closed doors, had already ignited private panic. But today, she wasn't hiding behind pages. She was ready to speak. The room fell into an unnatural stillness as Charlotte began recounting her experiences. She didn't raise her voice, didn't dramatize. She spoke plainly, but each word landed like a quiet storm. She told them how she felt when Camilla entered the room, how laughter died, how smiles faded, how the air seemed colder. She described moments of being silenced with a look, the sting of being told to know her place, and the sense of invisibility that grew over time. No one interrupted her. No one dared. Because within her soft tone lay a truth so piercing it disarmed the very foundation of royal hierarchy. Camilla's response was everything they expected, and yet somehow worse. There was no apology, no softness, only denial masked as self-preservation. She claimed manipulation, suggesting that Charlotte's views had been shaped by outside influence, that the child had misunderstood, that she was too young to interpret complex dynamics. But the more she spoke, the more her detachment bled through. It wasn't the voice of a woman seeking clarity, it was the voice of someone fighting to retain control. Catherine sat silently through most of it, her composure slipping only once when Charlotte spoke about the day she stopped wanting to attend royal events, just to avoid the weight of unspoken judgment. A single tear escaped Catherine's control, not from pain alone, but from a deep maternal ache and knowing that her daughter had seen too much, too soon. And for a moment, it was no longer about monarchy. It was about a mother and her child, and the cost of survival inside a golden cage. Prince William, long taught to prioritize duty over emotion, found himself standing in unfamiliar territory. For once, the choice wasn't abstract. It wasn't about policy or tradition. It was about flesh and blood. And in that moment, he chose Charlotte. He didn't speak volumes. He didn't need to. He placed his hand on her shoulder and simply said, "I believe you." That single sentence cut deeper than any royal decree. It drew a line not just through the room but through the legacy they all shared. And then there was Charles. Torn, trapped between a daughter's voice and a wife's pride. He listened. He nodded. But he said little. Because anything he said would tip a balance that had already begun to unravel. He had hoped the meeting would mend the fracture. Instead, it widened it. But even as the dust settled inside those walls, the outside world was already catching wind of something scandalous. It was supposed to be private. But royal secrets never stay buried for long. Within 48 hours, headlines blared, "Young Princess exposes Queen's secret self." The monarchy's polished fade was cracking. The leak wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't strategic. It was chaos. Someone close enough to access the diary's contents had chosen to blow the gates open. The press received it in fragments, handwritten excerpts, emotional confessions, and that now infamous quote, "A crown without kindness." It was enough. Enough to detonate the story. Enough to unleash a media storm the palace couldn't outrun. Suddenly, Princess Charlotte was no longer a sheltered royal child. She was a lightning rod. A voice. And without ever stepping in front of a camera, she became the most talked about figure in Britain overnight. Social media took the spark and turned it into wildfire. Hashtags surged within hours, hashtag Charlotte was right, hashtag the crown cracked, hashtag silent no more. The younger generation, long skeptical of royal traditions, saw in Charlotte not just a princess but a symbol of generational defiance. The old rules, stay quiet, stay loyal, stay invisible, were crumbling. Memes collided with op-eds, influencers quoted diary lines, and public opinion twisted in a direction the firm hadn't anticipated. This wasn't a scandal they could contain. It was a movement. Behind palace gates, the mood turned frantic. The royal PR team, veterans of countless crises, were paralyzed. How do you spin the heartbreak of a child? How do you silence the words of someone too young to play the game but old enough to see its shadows? The strategy was to downplay, deny, delay. But every statement they crafted felt colder, more distant. The public wasn't listening anymore. They were watching Catherine and Charlotte, and for once, they believed them without needing approval. Camilla, once the face of stability after Diana's storm, found herself spiraling into retreat. Public events were suddenly postponed, media engagements rescheduled. Behind the scenes, her frustration turned inward. She blamed the staff, the media, even the palace's inaction. But most of all, she blamed the shifting tide. Because for the first time, her position felt less earned, more exposed. Every camera lens now searched for signs of guilt. Every handshake was judged. And every smile was dissected. Support for Catherine grew quietly but undeniably. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence was dignified, her presence unshaken. Charlotte remained out of view as the palace scrambled to project control. But control was gone, and in its place stood a truth the monarchy could no longer smother, one written by a girl too young to understand power, yet wise enough to hold it in her hands. Meanwhile, Charles stood on the edge of a quiet collapse. His marriage strained, his role questioned, his legacy beginning to fracture under the weight of one truth: no king is trained to confront that power built on silence eventually shatters. Conversations with Camilla grew short, clipped. Long nights ended without resolution. Old wounds between them reopened under the pressure. She wanted a defense. He wanted a pause. Neither got what they needed. And just when the monarchy thought the worst was over, Charlotte made a move no one could have predicted. She stood on the steps of a children's hospital, scheduled to read a thank you note. But what came next stunned even her parents. Charlotte put down the script and spoke from the heart. What was meant to be a routine appearance, a carefully orchestrated photo opportunity to shift the headlines and remind the public of the royal family's charitable face, turned into something else entirely. Charlotte, flanked by her mother and security staff, was handed a printed speech suite, simple, non-controversial. But as her eyes scanned the paper, something within her shifted. Perhaps it was the faces of the children watching her. Perhaps it was the weight of weeks of silence following the media storm. Whatever it was, she gently placed the note aside, lifted her gaze, and began to speak not as a princess, not as a performer, but as a child with something to say. Her words were quiet, but each syllable echoed with meaning. Without ever naming names or referencing the chaos that had erupted around her, she said what no one had expected. Sometimes she said softly, "Kindness is louder than crowns. And being kind, even when no one is watching, is the bravest thing anyone can do." The crowd froze. Journalists forgot their camera cues. Even Catherine, composed and graceful by instinct, turned to her daughter with a look of disbelief and pride that words couldn't contain. Charlotte didn't linger. She thanked the hospital staff, smiled at the children, and stepped back. But the damage or the healing had been done. Within minutes, news outlets around the world broke the story. Princess Charlotte breaks silence with subtle royal rebuke. Editorials flooded in. Commentators hailed the moment as a generational shift, a royal reckoning not delivered in rage, but wrapped in grace. And yet, it hit harder than any accusation. Because it came from the mouth of a child. Because it was raw, unrehearsed, and undeniably sincere. Catherine said nothing during or after the speech. She didn't need to. Her silence was maternal strength. Her presence alone told the world where she stood. Camilla's absence, on the other hand, spoke volumes. She had been scheduled to attend but withdrew last minute, citing a private matter. But speculation ran wild. Was it a strategic retreat? Or did she know what Charlotte might do? There was one moment the cameras almost missed. A pendant, subtle but familiar, hung around Charlotte's neck. It was confirmed later to be a small keepsake from Princess Diana's collection, quietly gifted by her father months prior. Symbolic or not, the public saw meaning in it. The people didn't just see Charlotte anymore, they saw a thread of Diana's spirit reborn. Not in defiance of the crown, but in defiance of silence. She wasn't echoing her grandmother's rebellion. She was forging her own gentler, yet just as sharp. In a single appearance, Charlotte had redefined her place. Not as a pawn of the monarchy, but as a voice for its future. And the people responded. Support surged once more. The monarchy, already fragile, now faced a new kind of threat, not scandal, but truth wrapped in innocence. The kind that couldn't be denied or deflected. But inside the palace, what Charlotte had done was viewed as open defiance, and retaliation was brewing. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Queen Camilla began to remove people, shift protocols, and quietly isolate the very voices that dared challenge her. Charlotte had started a war, and now the counterattack began. It started subtly, so subtly that at first, no one could confirm if it was deliberate or merely coincidence. Engagements that once included Charlotte were suddenly rescheduled or replaced with others. Photo opportunities that had previously highlighted the young royal's growing popularity were quietly removed from public rotation. Appearances alongside Catherine were scaled down. It wasn't a purge, it was precision. Camilla was wielding the one weapon she had mastered over decades: invisibility by design. She didn't need to erase Charlotte's words. She only needed to control how often they were heard again. Then came the internal reshuffling. Staff members long loyal to Catherine and William were reassigned without warning. Some were promoted, others transferred. But the effect was the same: the couple's inner circle thinned. Whispers filled the corridors. Talk of Camilla reasserting dominance. of reclaiming what had momentarily slipped from her hands. No one dared speak openly, but the tension was no longer just political, it was psychological. Even longtime aides admitted they now checked twice before sharing anything that could be interpreted as support for Charlotte. Loyalty was being measured, and anything less than silence became a threat. The pressure grew more direct. Catherine and William began receiving private, but unmistakable warnings. Public neutrality was expected. Any display of alliance, any hint of resistance, would be viewed as disloyalty to the crown. The same crown their daughter had just indirectly challenged. Behind the language of unity were veiled threats, and both of them knew it. But if Camilla expected retreat, she underestimated a mother's resolve. Catherine didn't fold. She didn't shout, but she tightened her circle, sharpened her presence, and made it clear her daughter would not be buried beneath tradition. Then, a mysterious letter surfaced. Sent anonymously to a prominent columnist, it hinted that emotional manipulation was being used to sway public sympathy. It didn't name Charlotte outright, but it didn't need to. The intent was clear: to reframe the narrative, to cast doubt, to chip away at the fragile pedestal the young princess now stood on. But the strategy backfired. The public, already protective of Charlotte, doubled down in their support. The letter read like desperation, a shadow move in a game where the queen no longer held public favor. Still, behind palace walls, the fear of sabotage was real. William, for all his diplomacy, began to suspect deeper fractures forming beneath the surface. Someone was orchestrating more than just a PR shift. Lines were being drawn, and the stakes were rising with every move made in secret. But in the eye of this storm, Charlotte remained calm. She carried on as if untouched, shielded not by ignorance but by a growing understanding of the world she'd inherited. Catherine, however, was no longer passive. Her instincts sharpened, and her defenses rose. She knew this wasn't over. The retaliation had only just begun, and as history had shown time and again, palaces don't fall from scandal alone. They crumble when the truth refuses to be silenced. But retaliation only fueled the fire, and what came next marked the beginning of a new royal legacy. From a moment of truth came a tidal wave of change. Princess Charlotte, once just a young royal in the background, had sparked a conversation far greater than anyone imagined. And now, a new generation was stepping forward with eyes wide open. She hadn't asked for the spotlight, but once it found her, she refused to let it blind her. Instead, she used it to illuminate what had long been hidden behind velvet curtains and carefully crafted smiles. The public embraced her not because she was royal, but because she was real. Her voice, soft yet unwavering, cracked open a wall of tradition that had long silenced emotional transparency. In Charlotte, people saw more than a princess, they saw a symbol of emotional courage, of authenticity, in a world that prized image over honesty. Inside the palace, the shift was undeniable. William and Catherine, quietly but decisively, began reshaping the tone of their public roles. They didn't make sweeping declarations or dramatic gestures. Instead, they started showing up differently, more approachable, more involved, more willing to connect. The monarchy under their guidance began to tilt toward empathy, toward humility. The next generation was no longer content with ceremonial perfection. It was time to make the crown feel human again. Even Charles, who had long relied on the balance between loyalty and image, began to change. In subtle yet deliberate ways, he started distancing himself from Camilla during engagements. There were fewer joint appearances, less shared focus, and an unmistakable shift in how the court presented their dynamic. No statements were made. None were needed. The silence spoke louder than words. The old order built on protocol, fear, and carefully measured silence was being replaced. Youth and truth were rising. What had once been considered disruptive was now understood as necessary. Charlotte, in her quiet bravery, had redrawn the lines between monarchy and humanity. And through it all, she found herself. She wasn't just the daughter of a prince. She was the granddaughter of a woman who had once shaken the very soul of the monarchy. That same fire now lived in her, not in rebellion, but in resolve. The final image that the world would remember wasn't one of scandal or confrontation. It was of Charlotte walking beside her mother, shoulders squared, eyes forward, heart steady, not with defiance, but with purpose. Diana's legacy burned in her steps not as a shadow, but as a light. The crown may rest on ancient heads, but its future now lives in the eyes of a girl who dared to speak the truth. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.